Hey class, this video is a follow-up to our live session on Monday. So let's jump right into it. Last night, we talked about the transition implementation ecology, all of those inner setting, outer setting, process factors, characteristics of individuals, all of those factors that contribute to high quality transition practices, programs, and services. And more specifically for this semester, those factors that contribute to the transition problem and practice that you're going to be focusing on this semester. So whether that's a problem and practice related to a practice program or a service, we really disentangled last night what that transition ecology or that implementation ecology looks like. According to research in the literature, so we talked about the Consolidated Framework for Implementation Research, long title, I know. We'll call that the CFR framework or CFR constructs. And we also started talking a little bit last night about the process we'll be using this semester in order to take ourselves from an initial idea about a problem in practice and end up with data-driven recommendations to improve that problem in practice, along with tools, resources, tips and tricks, and specific strategies that should be used in order to address your recommendations. So if your data says this particular area needs to be improved, you'll by the end have created and found a mix of both resources, whether it be assessment, curriculum, instruction, strategies, practices, you name it, to address those recommendations so they can actually be implemented. In this class, though, due to the condensed nature of the class, we have 10 weeks. You won't be implementing your recommendations, but you will be developing all of the tools and resources needed to implement them if you choose to do that after the course is complete. So last night, we just started to scratch the surface about what is called education design research. And I mentioned to you last night that education design research is best thought of as, here we go, is best thought of as a education-based approach to engineering or developing a tool or product. So for this class, you're going to be focused on completing the first two stages of education design research. The first two stages of education design research are analysis and exploration, and that's followed up by design and construction. When it comes to analysis and exploration, this is the first step in which you identify your problem in practice, which you've already started doing last night, and you'll continue to do this week in your 2.1 organizer. And from that, you work to develop your research question that will guide everything you do in your study. Once you have your research question, you then develop a tool to collect data related to your problem in practice. So you'll actually create in this case, an online survey tool to gather data from stakeholders at your site about the problem in practice. So how often practices occur, when they do, how effectively they occur, and the wide range of factors that may be influencing the frequency and effectiveness of those practices, programs, or services. So this is all part of analysis / exploration. This is that first step of education design research of this 4-step process. So this, in terms of timeline, this is going to be happening across many of the first weeks of the class. Really, the first half, the first 5 weeks is when you're working on this, first 5 or 6 weeks. And then for the remaining about 4 weeks of the class, we'll move into design and construction. So based upon the literature and data about the problem that you've collected, You will develop and pull from online and your own knowledge and your professional experiences, research and evidence-based interventions that can support improving the problem in practice. So we talked a little bit about the different areas you may be interested in researching last night. One of those, just as off the top of my head, was talking about building continuity of programming, right, for young people. So when they graduate, they have opportunities to be integrated in the community. So when we're talking about programming, you may be pulling curriculum, strategies for collaboration, building out what the structure of a program might look like, whether that's be designing something from scratch or changing a component of a pre-existing program or service. But these are all things that you'll learn how to do in this class. So think about, these are things you already know how to do likely, but we'll be thinking about them in a more scientific way in terms of design and construction during this class. You'll be learning strategies during our weekly content and then practicing and building those out in your action research organizers. So this is our roadmap forward, essentially, for this entire course this semester. You'll be designing and implementing the first two steps of an education design research study. The additional steps are to then implement those recommendations, first on a small scale where you pilot them. And then over time, as you're evaluating, first and foremost, what that pilot implementation looks like. So how they're doing it, what are the factors contributing to how well it's being piloted, working at the challenges related to that initial implementation, and then scaling it up to widespread use, which ends up in a maturing intervention that's being used broadly and effectively. These are things that we won't do during this class in our 10 weeks together, but they are important to know that these are the next steps once you get through that design and construction phase. So in the evaluation and reflection phase, step, which is step 3 of EDR, the evidence-based intervention is implemented, or interventions, depending on how many and what things you're improving or changing as part of your problem in practice. And then you collect data regarding how well it's done, as well as the implementation context and how it's influencing what is done. So we typically think of, and you'll hear this word a lot this semester, of fidelity. You're probably already familiar with that term. Fidelity of implementation means there is already been an established way to do a practice that research says will result in a particular outcome. We know what the effective best practice is. Fidelity is how, to what extent is what's being done matching what we already know best practice is. And then the fourth step, once again, we won't be doing either step 3 or 4 this semester, but the fourth step of EDR is your maturing intervention. So the use of the practice program or service is highly effective now, high fidelity. It's widespread in whatever transition ecology you're researching or working in. So that might be as small as a department, could be your school, your district, your agency, your organization. It's whatever that implementation ecology is, but it's widespread use in that ecology. And ideally, it's done so well and in context that it exceeds what we know about the use and effectiveness of how other people have already done it, so we can contribute to the field's knowledge about effective practices. That's our pie in the sky goal there, that we not only build these changes to practices, programs, and services that support our young people and families, but at the same time, we take on these problems, create and design and build innovative strategies, implement them, and support the field, so the field is able to learn from the good work that we do as well. And this all goes back to that idea of a research to practice gap, that research happens, it doesn't filter down into the field, great work happens in the field, really effective strategies and practices, but it doesn't get researched. So there's this disconnect between in the field, we have a lot of things we do that know it works, but we don't have any research behind it. And there's a lot of research about what works and about effective practices, but it doesn't always get down to the people who need it. So this is the field's kind of one of many approaches to bridging that gap. So EDR, as we've been talking about, has 4 steps. You will be completing steps 1 and 2 of EDR this semester. So just a brief recap again, you're going to identify your problem in practice and construct a research question related to that problem in practice. And then later on in the semester, you'll be collecting data on the problem in practice. And you'll then be using that data to design solutions to specifically address intersetting and process factors that contribute to that problem in practice. So remember, those are organizational factors that influence the quality of programs, practices, and services, and also when those practices, programs, and services are actually done, supporting the process, the fidelity of how they're implemented as well, not just the factors within the organization, school, district, community that influence implementation. But I think we had I forget who said last night, but it may have been Anita that in that moment when it comes time to implement, right, when the rubber hits the road, are you ready, right? That's your intersetting factors that are contributing, but also from that moment forward, when you actually implement, is it done in a way that models best practice, in a way that we know is going to result in the outcomes that our young people and families want? So we also talked about this last night, but this is just a review. Identifying and articulating your problem in practice is your entire focus for this week. This is out of the whole process we've just talked about. Don't worry about anything else other than identifying your problem in practice, getting your research question together from that problem in practice. That's your focus this week and what we'll be working on together. So you are going to follow this process of breaking it down scientifically in order to identify your problem in practice. You're going to first think about what student or individual outcome needs improvement for your site, organization, agency. Your site might be a school or district, and in what context. So I'll just throw an example out there. Maybe my problem in practice is that we've got students completing in an 18 to 21 program, they're completing their work internships, and we want to improve the competitive integrated employment outcomes for our program for our students who graduate from the 18 to 21 program. That's our goal. So, and in what context? We've already contextualized it's the 18 to 21 program students, and we want to improve their outcomes for competitive integrated employment. So then we say, okay, what practices, programs, or services happen already to support these outcomes at the site? So for, in this example ongoing, my 18 to 21 program, what are we doing right now that contributes to our young people reaching competitive integrated employment after they graduate our program? What challenges to success exist in our current ecology? So we've got our program and our work sites, and we're working with students to build, let's say, specifically focusing in on their work readiness skills and their occupation specific skills, let's say. So soft skills, interviewing skills, all of that, but also some task management, things like that. And so we're doing these, and we don't really know if they're working. We don't have a lot of data on who's doing what, when, and how. But these are things that are talked about in kind of in our team meetings, let's say, but we need more information. I give you this example because identifying a problem in practice, it is naturally a process where you're going to consistently say, well, I don't have that information yet. Oh, I don't have that information. That's good. That is telling you and giving you a blueprint for what you're going to have to collect information on for your study. you'll collect information beyond that, but it kind of gives you a starting point. It starts to focus you in on what you're going to need to investigate. And then also what challenges exist to what you're currently doing. So maybe in this example I'm giving now of my 18 to 21 program, maybe we have challenges regarding the use of assessment and progress monitoring, let's say, for our students at their work sites to really track their performance and their growth over time, and to make data-driven decisions about how we can differentiate and best support them. So when they graduate our program, they are prepared to get competitive integrated employment, which is my outcome in this example. And from that, we then say, okay, this is an initial snapshot of what we think we're doing, what potential challenges we think we've experienced, and once again, trying to be as objective as possible. So every time we say, well, this is happening, we immediately have to say to ourselves, well, what evidence exists to say that that is not happening? In our Jamboard last night, you had great points about bias and objectivity in research, which are fundamental to gathering valid data that leads to valid decisions about how to improve programs. Why do we want valid data to make valid decisions? Because there's nothing more important, right, than supporting our young people and families. And we don't want to take missteps and experiment with programs and practices when we have an opportunity to collect data and know exactly what we can do and what we need to do to support the environment that supports families and young people, of course, to reach their goals. So in order to make sure we are staying objective and also we're focusing in on what we already know works, right? Not reinventing the wheel. The final part of identifying your problem in practice is to look in the literature about what are these effective practices that have already been identified related to this problem. So if we've got our 18 to 21 program in this example, and we're really looking to build our students' work readiness skills, maybe soft skills, their task management skills, self-management skills, and we look in the literature and say, well, I'm not the first person to have this problem, right, with a site. So what exists out there? What are people doing to support soft skills and work readiness skills for young people with disabilities of this age group for this outcome, right? There's literature on that already. There's literature on a host of different areas and all of the areas that you've mentioned last night that you'd like to research. So what is a problem in practice? It should be focused on what practitioners are doing and how that directly and indirectly impacts transition outcomes. It's practical, so it's within the site's control. I mentioned last night about don't take on the fire-breathing dragon. This problem in practice needs to be a problem happening right now. It has to be observable and measurable. So we'll stay away from problems in practice that are hopefully related to perceptions or beliefs about how programs should be. And what we're focused on instead is, what are the programs? What's happening right now? What's working? What's not? What makes it work? What makes it not work? That's what we're measuring. Not perceptions or beliefs about the way something should be designed. We're focused in on getting a full, as objective as possible picture about the current implementation of practices, programs, and services so that we can make really specific recommendations for how to address the problem. So it's also applicable in its impact and solution. So your recommendations that come from the data to a broad range of young people, not just one young person. So when I say that, and I talked about this last night, It could be your problem in practice, could be in your classroom, could be in your grade or your school. Notice how I'm kind of moving outward to these bigger levels of the ecology. Could be in your district, could be in your organization, agency, department, right? Your business, your nonprofit, whatever it may be, your provider. So what we're saying here is that it's not that you have to have absolutely the largest amount of young people affected by this, but any young person who is currently impacted by that problem in practice, that we want to make sure that our solutions support all of them as much as possible, not just one case. So not just one IEP, but all of the students. In my example, if I'm doing this problem in practice, I'm not going to focus on supporting one student. I'm going to support and change and improve programming in my 18 to 21 program for all of my students. So all of them are better supported to build their work readiness skills and their soft skills in my example. And of course, as you mentioned last night in your Padlet, which was, your Jamboard, which was great, staying objective and based on what there is evidence for and what there isn't evidence for, we then attempt to collect data on that practice, program, or service or factor so that we're able to make objective decisions about what's going on and what can be improved. We showed this last night as well. So areas of focus for research that are more actionable can be addressed directly with changes to practice that staff can implement with support from internal resources. So staff knowledge, experience, internal policies to some degree, resources, training, and those opportunities are dependent upon internal resources that are readily available. The internal setting, the inner setting may not have those resources, but these are resources that we can get online and we can easily get either at low or no cost. So the problem in practice, let's say back to my example for my 18 to 21 program, our problem in practice is supporting our students to reach their competitive integrated employment, but we have a pretty good handle based upon our assessment data, at least what we have, that students are experiencing challenges with the way that we currently provide our work readiness training, curriculum, our assessment, and our soft skills instruction. So students are having challenges with the way that we provide it, and we could do potentially better with the way that we structure and provide that instruction and opportunities. So we may not have curriculum or assessment to take this on, or we might not know the different instructional methods we could use, right? So just going on with this example, different modeling technique, video modeling, self-as model, right? Task analysis, direct observation, reflective journaling, different types of age-appropriate transition assessments, right? Self-reports, checklists, you name it. We might not have experience with these things in my 18 to 21 program, according to the data that we collect. However, these are things we can get online easily, most of them for free already, through the National Center for Technical Assistance for Transition, NTACT, and other resources, the IRIS Center out of Vanderbilt University, different states have tons of resources. The Pennsylvania Bureau of Special Education, which I work for, has a ton of resources on PATN, which is the PA Training and Technical Assistance Network website. There's a host of resources there as well. So we're talking about things that are more actionable in the sense that this is something that internally we can take on, and we don't need too much external support to make it happen. And the external support we do need, we can get. And less actionable items are those that can't be addressed without first addressing some inner setting challenges. So that's that fire breathing dragon that you want to take on this complex multi-step issue, but you need to take on the individual steps first and break it down. So Those less actionable items are external policies, right? External collaboration to some degree. And then even some internal policies can potentially be less actionable, but collaboration between those key three groups of stakeholders that are always involved in transition: young people with disabilities, their family members, and stakeholders in your organization, school district, but also those connecting and collaborating with you, whether it be VR or your providers, your centers for independent living, your local nonprofits, right? Your Goodwill, your ARC, Health and Human Services, the list goes on, right? Juvenile justice, supporting youth who experience homelessness, right? So your LEA, of course, too. So this is how we think about less actionable and more actionable areas of research. So less actionable requires change within and between external partners, and a lot of that change is uncontrollable by your site. More actionable, things that we can take on within. Here's just a few other examples. So on that far end of less actionable is we really can't change indicator 13 compliance at all, right? So for us, for having a compliant transition plan, it has already been detailed for us by Department of Education and guidance by our state special education agencies. So that is ironclad. We can't change that. State and technical assistance, we can provide recommendations, but we really don't have a lot of control over that. District policies, not much control over that. Internally, collaboration between internal and external staff, we do have some control over that. We start moving towards your site's capacity to address these factors. Parental engagement in transition, that may be really easy for your site, but it also may be really difficult for others. Collaboration between internal staff, curriculum, assessment, and instruction as well. So how do we identify our problem in practice? So here are some sources of information to guide you. Professional experiences and reflections through an objective lens on your student client outcomes that are not as good as they could be, and the effectiveness of practices, programs, and services that are happening right now to support them. So trying to do some initial linkages between, based upon your professional experiences, what your student outcomes are and how practices, programs, and services are contributing to why those outcomes occur. Remember from our conversation last night that student outcomes are a symptom of the health of the transition ecology that supports them. It is a complete and full indicator of the work that we do. The outcomes that young people achieve, and this is not my professional perspective, but incredibly well documented in really rigorous research for our field that this is what leads to student outcomes. The large majority of variance in outcomes for students is attributed to the work that we do. A very, very small portion of it is contributed to other factors beyond the practices, programs, and services that we provide to them. Those other factors being related to socioeconomic and other environmental. But I guess the point is that whether it be influenced by the work that we do or some of those factors we can't control, the outcomes are the result of the interplay between all of those factors. The outcomes are not dependent upon solely the young person and what they're going to do. The capacity of the young person is so reliant on the strength of the system that supports them. This is what the literature unquestionably shows us. We've had the benefit in our field of having a decade-long longitudinal transition study. Maybe some of you have previously read some literature in previous classes about the National Longitudinal Study on Transition, but some really rigorous in-depth research has been used with that data to show just how powerful environment is in resulting in post-school outcomes for young people. So professional experiences, as we kind of come back to this slide here from that caveat, we also, when possible, conversations with colleagues and external stakeholders. So not just your professional experiences, but reflecting on team conversations that you've had and trainings you've had, conversations in your organization and district or agency about this problem in practice. Likely this is already being discussed. That's why it's on your mind, right? And if you have available your school, organization, agency, district data, whatever your level of implementation is going to be for your problem in practice on the current problem in practice. So probably you don't have any, but always if there is some data available, as much as possible, we want to situate ourselves in that data. So if we're looking, go back to my example of my 18 to 21 program, if we think this problem in practice is that we're not supporting our young people to develop their work readiness and soft skills, we'll definitely, if we have it available, we want to look at some assessment data and some performance and progress data and maybe our transition portfolios and speak to our students about their experiences and where they feel supported and what they still want to work on and need. Think about our meetings we have in transition planning meetings with our young people and their families and their teams. So any data we have, data just doesn't have to be quantitative data. It could be data from your transition planning meetings, looking at documents, but situating yourself objectively about all the information you currently have about a problem in practice, coupling that with your professional experiences and the conversations you've had with colleagues related to this problem as much as possible. So this way you are gathering sources of information that cut down on your potential bias because you're going to be real close to the problem in practice, likely, to make sure you get those different perspectives. So I just want to bring you through step-by-step now of identifying a problem in practice. This models exactly what you have in your 2.1 organizer, which is where you will do this work this week. So let's start off with, what is the student client outcome that needs improvement? So I just give an example here. Youth are not gaining the problem solving, core academic knowledge, and specific occupation or technical skills that need to be successful in their work placements. That's my outcome. What evidence is there to support this outcome? Thinking about it in terms of evidence to support and refute what we're saying. So site supervisor evaluations are uniformly identifying these needs. Students are self-reporting these challenges. During program and individual transition planning meetings, most of our students, teachers have provided summaries of their formative assessment data for their students that show that most students are not developing and mastering these skills. And we know this is related to our problem in practice of our programs, practice, and services we're providing to young people to develop these skills. Young people aren't developing these skills as much as they would like to reach their goals. And we know that that's a symptom of the quality of what we're doing as stakeholders. So what evidence is there to refute this claim, right? So checking my bias here. So some of the formative assessments in my example have been used to evaluate student performance and growth are generalized, and maybe they're not the best measures of what students can do and what they can do independently. So maybe the data we currently have, the data tools for assessment, are not as well aligned with our student needs. So maybe we're just not collecting the data we need. That could be a potential reason why we have an unclear picture of this problem in practice. What practices, programs, and services are contributing to why young people aren't developing these skills or reaching these outcomes? Well, maybe in my example, we have a career cluster course of study, and it's provided to students and it emphasizes soft skills and workplace behaviors. Maybe that's something we're already doing, and our coordinators recently led a review of the curriculum and noted that maybe there's a lack of structured learning. So we're using a curriculum, we're not really sure who's using it, but when we do, maybe it's not as effective as it could be. We need more information, though, to really know for sure what content and instruction and assessment looks like to support our young people in this example. Then we start thinking about what are our inner and outer and process factors or stakeholder factors as well that might contribute to this problem in practice of our programs are not supporting young people to build the skills they need for competitive integrated employment. So maybe in my example here for my program, many of our teachers are not certified in CTE for career and technical education. That's what CTE is. Or have been provided PD related to career clusters that are, and these teachers are teaching knowledge and skills related to career clusters that they haven't had PD for, right? So maybe they're not certified and they haven't had PD related to career clusters and career and technical education, but they're being asked to do it anyway, right? This is pretty common. Not a lot of folks are, just in this example, are CTE certified. And but that doesn't mean we're not going to do that work anyway. A lot of the times we have to, right? A lot of folks come into transition roles and kind of learn and grow in that role from being a teacher and also being in a transition coordinator or specialist role. So always wearing a lot of hats, and quite a few times folks are not supported by the organization, school, district, community, agency, department, whatever it may be, to fulfill the role that they're being asked to fulfill, right? They're not being supported. So this example is also in the slides for you, so you can kind of look back. And finally, what does the literature say? So if we've got this problem in practice, we've got an initial idea of maybe what we're doing and maybe what doesn't work, and maybe some potential factors that might be influencing this problem in practice. And our final part is, so what does the literature say about what should be happening to reach the outcomes that we'd like to see? So I just gave an example. This is true related to this. So the fictitious example I'm giving you, but what is directly shown in the literature, this is true in the literature for this example I've been giving you, is that literature shows that paid work-based learning programs and job readiness training that focus on soft skills and occupational skills are evidence-based predictors of competitive integrated employment. So we know these are things that we need to focus on. What we don't necessarily have the information yet about is what are the specific practices, strategies, tools that we need to use to provide high quality programming related to supporting our young people and families to reach these post-school goals that we have identified. And it's okay that you don't have that information, because that's the point of your study. You'll be developing a tool to gather the information you don't have. All of those holes that you have after you complete 2.1, you'll probably leave it thinking, wow, there's so much I need to know in order to really be able to take this on. I feel like I don't have a good handle on it. That's fine. That's how research is. That's why we collect data. But this first process lets us know, at least initially, what data we're going to need to collect. And in week 2, you'll learn a specific process for identifying exactly what practices, programs, and services you're going to collect data on, developing questions to measure them, collecting that highly valid and reliable data to make decisions on. So hang tight for that. Right now, we're just focused on getting an initial objective perspective on this problem in practice that you'll investigate and develop recommendations to improve this semester. So this is just that example completed for you. It's also in your slides. You can take a look back. So now let's talk about research questions. So imagine that we've got our problem in practice. And our next step here then is once we've got that problem in practice and these components built out, we're going to create a research question that'll guide us. This research question is designed to investigate the problem, which results in data that informs the design and implementation process for strategies to improve that problem. So a nice way to think about this is that if the problem in practice is your initial conversation, the research question solidifies that and focuses you down into exactly what you're going to investigate this semester. So what is an actionable research question? It's based upon the problem in practice that can be improved through education design research, which is the methodology we're using this semester. It's designed to gather information that is needed to improve the implementation of specific practices, programs, and services related to your problem in practice. And it's comprised of the following clearly defined components. So it has your independent variable, which is the practice to be improved. So the practice, program, or service to be improved. The outcome is that if we improve those practices, programs, and services, this is the student or family level outcome that will result of improving our practices. The population for who's implementing the practices, so which stakeholders, and who's benefiting and being served by those practices. So young people, family members. And where does implementation occur? Is it in your program? Is it in a school? Is it at the district level? Where is it? In your agency? So an actionable research question is more than just a statement that you intend to investigate. It's going to be based upon your reflection and description of the problem in practice. It's designed to gather information needed to change practices, programs, or services. It's a guide for the very design of your study, and it'll tell you the types of data you'll collect. It's comprised of these variables that we just mentioned, and it's reflective of valid sources of information. So we're being as objective as possible. Really, it's your unique argument that will be investigated. So what it is not a hypothesis. So a scientific hypothesis about we're going to do this and this will happen. We're investigating, we're gathering data. We're not proving something. It's not your opinion or subjective thoughts. It's not very broad, covering multiple topics. It's not missing any of these components. And it should be answered. It should not be answered by one sentence. So if I have a research question, it should not be how many chickens are roosting in Mr. F's office at GW, right? I can answer that. I can say 45 or something ridiculous, right? Not really, of course, but I shouldn't be able to answer my actionable research question right now, immediately. The point of the question is to guide you to gather the data that you currently don't have so you can address this problem in practice. So let's look a little bit more about this structure. So the practice is the independent variable. It's what we want to change. It's what we want to improve. And when we improve the practice, it then changes and impacts a particular student or family outcome. This all happens in context. So where does the practice, program, or service happen? Who's doing it? And at what level? I use the word level in terms of the implementation ecology. Is this a student outcome, a family outcome, school, program, district? What is the outcome? So to this point of, to this point of identifying what your overarching practice that you're going to investigate is, you want to be a mix between broad enough that you can parse it out into its multiple components, but not too broad that you'll have so many things to measure that it no longer relates to your problem in practice. And that'll make more sense in a moment. But what we can do is we can focus ourselves when we're trying to think about what our independent variable is going to be. And I'll keep reminding you what that is. Our independent variable is the practice, program, or services that we want to change in order to improve an outcome, right? So that's the practice we change that leads to the outcome, which is the dependent variable. So we can think about our independent variables in terms of what are called the predictors of post-school outcomes in secondary transition. So predictors are transition practices, programs, or services, or in-school student outcomes that are positively correlated with young people achieving specific post-school outcomes. So for this class, we're only going to focus on practices, programs, and services that have been linked in the literature towards specific post-school outcomes related to your problem in practice. So just super briefly, what does correlated mean? Well, when we look at the national data on transition, not surprisingly, I don't have to tell you this, you see it in your own work, that there's a lot of variation in post-school attainment for students that we work with. And a large body of research has focused on explaining statistically what is contributing most to this variation, particularly variation that leads to positive post-school outcomes. The predictors of post-school outcomes are the practices or outcomes that explain a lot of the variation in post-school attainment. So the things that we do are practices, programs, and services that explain a lot of why students will have strong post-school outcomes. I like to think about this in terms of a pie chart here. So that variation in the outcome, in their post-school outcomes attributed to a specific transition practice or skill. And then there's always going to be some variation that's unexplained. That unexplained being all of those socioeconomic factors as well, right? The things that we can't control, but what we can control and improve and support in an easier way are the things that we do to support young people to reach their goals. So why I'm telling you this is because in your study, you're going to be using these domains, these predictors, to develop your research question. So for example, vocational education is a predictor of post-school outcomes, right? That's an overarching domain of practices, programs, and services. So underneath vocational education, there are a myriad of practices, programs, services, and implementation factors that influence that, right? So what you'll be doing is looking in the Rowe et al. 2015 article. This vocational education and other domains of practice are already identified for you in that article. And this is where you'll be pulling from to identify your independent variable for your study. So the bottom line is that the independent variable needs to be specific to the problem, but broad enough to have sub-practices, which is why we're going to use these predictor categories. And then, as we saw on that previous slide, you'll dig down this semester into the subparts of those predictor categories and collect data on practices, programs, and services, as well as implementation factors related to that overarching domain of practice, which is related to your problem in practice. So for example, in my problem in practice, I was mentioning before, I've got an 18 to 21 program. We're supporting students in that work program in their internships. Outside of their internships, we're providing them with vocational education. And in my study, I would then dig down into the practices, programs, and services related to the vocational education we provide and the implementation factors that influence that vocational education we provide. So let's see some examples. My spoiler is that I'm going to give you a template to follow this semester to make your research question. So let's start off. What can be done to improve how? So I've got my interrogative there, thinking about, for those of you who have ever taught English, right? So thinking about our interrogatives, we're setting our sentence up to improve how. specific stakeholders, so our populations implementing and served, are implementing what practices, and in what setting for what specific population. So you can see that red there is those implementing and served, our green is the specific practices, and then our blue is the setting. And then our final part is to support what measurable outcome. So just take a moment here while this video is on to review this structure by yourself, and then I will continue on explaining. If you'd like to look at this structure a little more, you can pause the video and then continue, but I'm going to continue talking about this structure now. So I'll read it through together one more time. What can be done to improve how specific stakeholders are implementing or using specific practices in a particular setting for a specific population to support or increase a specific measurable outcome? So we can then plug in all of the components we were just talking about. So I might say, what can be done to improve how our teachers, our CTE teachers and our job coaches are implementing vocational education for our 18 to 21 program for our students with disabilities to support or increase their work readiness skills. So I just took our example and put this in to that template. You'll be doing the same thing. This is just another example too. So what can be done to improve how teachers, job coaches, and case managers are implementing age-appropriate transition assessment as well as curriculum and instruction at the 18 to 21 program, students with a developmental disability specifically, and self-determination skills. This is just another example. So making your research question. Here's your recipe. First, identify variables within your primary information about the problem in practice. So look in your 2.1 organizer in the first table there for you. It's on page 1. And identify practices that are most actionable based upon your current information. So which practices, programs, or services can be taken on according to the information you have about what's going to be most actionable, what has the least amount of unactionable barriers to it, that something that can be taken on that's more actionable. And thinking about into our previous slides with those 2 examples I gave you of those graphics with our continuum of how actionable an item is. You're going to define all of those components here from your problem in practice. So identify your practice, your outcome. This is already going to be in your 2.1 organizer in the first table. Focus in on who's doing it and for which population, and then the specific settings it's happening in. Then the second component of making your research question is to look in that row article and identify a predictor category that is aligned with your problem in practice, with your independent variable. And that becomes your independent variable. And then once you have these components, you input that into the structure we just talked about. So once again, you identify your research and evidence-based practices related to the independent variable. So you look at that row article, you look in the predictor categories and identify the category that matches best with your problem in practice. And then later on in the semester, once you have this research question, you'll be able to measure characteristics of different practices and factors that contribute to how well practices happen. And you'll be using the structure that we just talked about. So